She had exactly 3 things in her possession: a forged letter of introduction, a document she couldn't yet prove, and the kind of desperation that makes a woman either very dangerous or very foolish. Eleanor Voss was hoping to be the former. The rain had been falling since York. It followed her through 3 coaching inns, 2 broken axles, and 1 very unfortunate encounter with a goat on the road to Derbyshire. By the time the carriage rattled through the iron gates of Ashford Park, Eleanor's traveling cloak was soaked through, her gloves were ruined, and the letter tucked inside her corset, the one she had spent 6 weeks carefully composing, had gone slightly soft at the edges. She pressed her hand against her ribs, feeling the shape of it through the fabric. Still there. Still hers. Still the only thing standing between her and absolute ruin. The carriage stopped. Eleanor looked up at Ashford Park for the first time and felt, against her better judgment, something shrink inside her chest. She had expected a grand house. She had not expected this. The building rose out of the dark like something that had always existed, like it had not been built so much as simply decided upon by the landscape itself. 4 stories of pale stone, 2 sweeping wings, and more windows than Eleanor had ever counted in a single structure. Light spilled from nearly all of them, warm and indifferent, the way light looks when it belongs to people who have never once had to worry about the cost of candles. Of course, she thought, of course it looks like this. She had grown up in a house with a leaking roof and 3 fireplaces that only 2 of them could afford to light. She had sold her mother's pearls to fund this journey. She had practiced her story so many times in the dark of the coaching inn that she sometimes woke up mid-sentence, lips moving, heart hammering. And now she was here, at the door of the man whose family had stolen everything from hers. Eleanor picked up her bag, one bag deliberately, because a poor relation would only have one, and stepped out into the rain. The butler who answered the door was exactly the kind of man Eleanor had anticipated. Silver-haired, impeccably composed, and deeply unimpressed. He looked at her the way butlers look at unexpected arrivals, not unkindly, but with the particular blankness of a man who has been trained to reveal nothing while thinking quite a lot. "Miss," he said. "Miss Eleanor Voss," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I believe I wrote ahead. I am a relation of the late Countess of Ashford, on the Pemberton side, quite distant, I'm afraid, and I find myself in rather reduced circumstances. I was hoping His Grace might— His Grace is not in the habit of receiving unannounced guests." "I did write ahead," Eleanor said again, pleasantly. The butler's expression suggested he found this claim optimistic. "If you would wait here, Miss Voss." He did not invite her inside. Eleanor stood on the steps in the rain and did not allow herself to feel anything about that. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps, unhurried, deliberate, the footsteps of a man who had never once needed to rush anywhere because the world arranged itself around him rather than the other way around. Then a voice, low and a little bored, speaking to someone just out of Eleanor's sightline. "Tell Hargreaves the mare is not to be ridden until the leg is properly seen to, and send word to London that I will not attending the castle for dinner. I have no interest in." He appeared in the doorway and stopped. James Ashford, 6th Duke of Ashford, looked at Eleanor the way one looks at something that has appeared on one's doorstep unexpectedly. Not with hostility exactly, but with the sort of mild, assessing displeasure that comes naturally to men who are accustomed to their households running without interruption. He was younger than she had imagined. She wasn't sure why she had imagined him older. Perhaps because his reputation was so firmly established, so complete, that she had unconsciously added years to it. But he couldn't have been more than 32 or 33, with dark hair and the kind of face that would have been almost handsome if it weren't currently arranged in an expression of faint irritation. He looked at her soaking cloak, her single bag, the rain dripping steadily from her hem onto his steps. Then he looked at her face. Eleanor met his gaze and did not flinch. Something shifted, almost imperceptibly, in his expression. "Miss Voss," the butler said quietly, appearing at his shoulder. "So I gathered," the Duke said. He studied her for a moment longer, and Eleanor had the uncomfortable sensation of being read, the way one reads a document one suspects may be fraudulent. "You wrote ahead, I'm told." "I did, Your Grace." "I did not receive your letter." "That is unfortunate," Eleanor said, "though I'm afraid the rain did not receive word either." A pause. The Duke blinked. Just once, just slightly, and Eleanor could not tell if she had amused him, offended him, or both. "Bring her in, Norris," he said at last, and turned away. "Put her in the east wing, the smaller guest room." Eleanor followed the butler inside, wringing a little rainwater quietly from her cuff. She knew which guest room he meant. She had done her research. It was not the best room. It was not even close to the best room. It was the room they gave to people they expected to leave quickly and not make a fuss. Good, she thought, climbing the stairs behind Norris, heart beating steadily, face perfectly composed. Let him underestimate me. Let him look right through me. They always do, and they are always wrong. Later, when the house had gone quiet and the fire in her small grate had burned down to embers, Eleanor sat on the edge of the narrow bed and unfolded the document she had carried from York. It was old. The paper had gone amber at the edges and the ink had faded in places, but the words were still legible to anyone who knew what they were looking for. A deed of transfer, a signature Eleanor recognized, a date that meant everything. She had one piece of this puzzle. The last piece, the piece that would make this document irrefutable, was somewhere in this house. She refolded it carefully, pressed it flat, and tucked it back against her ribs. Then she lay down on the narrow bed in the small room they had given her, stared up at the ceiling of Ashford Park, and allowed herself, just for a moment, just until she fell asleep, to think about the look on the Duke's face when she had not flinched. He noticed, she thought. He didn't expect that. Good. Neither would he expect what came next. The first morning at Ashford Park taught Eleanor 3 things. 1. The East Wing was cold in a way that suggested it was cold even in summer. 2. The household staff had already formed an opinion about her, and it was not a generous one. 3. Lady Miriam Ashford woke up early, moved quietly, and had the particular talent of appearing in doorways at precisely the wrong moment. Eleanor met her in the corridor outside the breakfast room. Lady Miriam was perhaps 40, dressed already in full-day clothes despite the hour, her dark hair arranged without a single pin out of place. She had the kind of beauty that had clearly once been striking, and had since settled into something more formidable, the beauty of a woman who had learned that being looked at and being underestimated were, in the right hands, the same weapon. She looked at Eleanor with an expression of polite, surgical curiosity. "You must be the Voss girl," she said. "Eleanor Voss, yes," Eleanor smiled. "And you are Lady Miriam, I believe, His Grace's cousin." Something moved behind Lady Miriam's eyes, the faint surprise of someone who had expected to do the introducing. "You've done your research," she said. "I've done my correspondence," Eleanor said pleasantly. "I wrote ahead, as I mentioned to His Grace." "Yes." Lady Miriam tilted her head slightly. "The letter no one received." "Quite." They looked at each other for a moment. 2 women standing in a cold corridor, both of them smiling, neither of them meaning it. "Well," Lady Miriam said at last, stepping aside to allow Eleanor into the breakfast room, "do come in. We are very informal at breakfast." "We," Eleanor noted, "not His Grace and I, just we," as though Lady Miriam had already folded herself so thoroughly into the fabric of this household that the distinction had ceased to matter. Eleanor filed this away and followed her inside. The Duke was already at the table. He was reading, or rather, he was holding a letter and frowning at it, which Eleanor was beginning to suspect was simply his natural resting expression. He did not look up when she entered, which she found she preferred. It gave her a moment to simply observe him without the complication of being observed in return. He had the kind of stillness that powerful men sometimes had. Not peace exactly, but the absence of the need to perform. He did not shift in his chair, he did not look around the room. He simply existed in it, fully and without apology, the way that a piece of furniture exists in a room it has occupied for a very long time. Eleanor found it profoundly irritating. She took the seat furthest from him and reached for the tea. "Miss Voss," he said it without looking up from his letter. "Your Grace, did you sleep?" It was not quite a question, more the verbal equivalent of a courtesy tick, the kind of thing one says at breakfast when one does not particularly care about the answer. "Very well, thank you," Eleanor said. "The East Wing is charming." Now he looked up. Eleanor looked back at him with an expression of complete sincerity. A pause, shorter than the one on the doorstep last night, but the same quality of pause, the same faint recalibration behind his eyes. Then he returned to his letter. Lady Miriam, Eleanor noticed, had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of a woman cataloging information. The days settled into a rhythm that Eleanor had not entirely anticipated. She had expected to be ignored. She had planned for it, in fact. Invisibility was useful. Invisibility allowed her to move through the house unnoticed, to learn its geography, to identify the location of the archive room that appeared on no household map, but which the housekeeper, Mrs. Crane, referred to twice in Eleanor's hearing as the record room off the East Library. What she had not planned for was the library itself. It was enormous. It was extraordinary. It was the kind of library that made Eleanor, who had grown up with 4 shelves of books and had treated each of them like a small personal friend, feel something dangerously close to joy. She was in it on the 3rd morning, standing on the rolling ladder with a copy of Gibbon she had absolutely no practical reason to be reading, when the Duke walked in. He stopped when he saw her. Eleanor, from her position approximately 8 feet above the floor, looked down at him. "Gibbon," he said after a moment. "The 3rd volume," Eleanor agreed. "You read Latin." It was not a question. He had noticed the open dictionary on the table below, the Latin dictionary, not the Greek one, though both were there. "My father taught me," Eleanor said, which was true and revealed nothing, which was intentional. "Your father." The Duke moved to his desk, unhurried, setting down the papers he carried. "The Voss family. Pemberton connection, you said." "Quite distant," Eleanor said. "Quite," he repeated. She climbed down from the ladder, Gibbon under her arm, and turned to find him closer than she expected. Not inappropriately so, but close enough that she could see he was doing it again. That reading a document expression. Assessing, searching for the thing that didn't quite fit. "Don't react," she told herself. "Don't shift. Don't look away." She didn't. "Who taught you Latin?" he asked. The question landed with a precision that told Eleanor he had been constructing it for several days, waiting for the right moment, the right angle. Poor relations do not read Gibbon in the original. Poor relations do not stand on library ladders at 8 in the morning with the focused ease of someone entirely at home among old books. Eleanor let the pause breathe for exactly 1 beat. Then she smiled. The small, composed smile she had practiced in the mirror of every coaching inn between York and Derbyshire. "A poor relation finds ways to occupy herself, Your Grace." She set Gibbon on the table, excused herself with a small curtsy, and walked out of the library at a pace that suggested she had nowhere in particular to be. She did not allow herself to exhale until she reached the corridor. That evening, Lady Miriam appeared in Eleanor's doorway without knocking. Eleanor was at her writing desk, composing a letter, a real one this time, to the solicitor in York who held the copies of her documents. She turned the paper over in one smooth motion before she looked up. Lady Miriam's eyes went to the desk, then to Eleanor's hands, then to Eleanor's face. "You turned your letter over," she said. "Private correspondence," Eleanor said. "I'm sure you understand." "Of course." Lady Miriam came inside, uninvited, unhurried, and sat in the chair by the window as though she had been sitting in it for years. "I wanted to speak with you, informally." "How pleasant." "I have been part of this household for 11 years, Lady Miriam said, "since my husband died. James, His Grace, has been very generous. He is a generous man, despite what people say about him." She paused. "He is also, beneath all of that, quite trusting, which is a quality people tend to take advantage of, in my experience." Eleanor looked at her steadily. "That is a great misfortune, isn't it?" Lady Miriam smiled, and it was a different smile now, the courtesy stripped out of it. "I find myself curious, Miss Voss. The Pemberton connection on the Voss side I've been trying to place it, you understand, purely out of family interest, quite difficult to trace." "Distant connections often are," Eleanor said. "Quite. And yet—" Lady Miriam tilted her head. "You carry yourself like a woman with somewhere very specific to be. That is not, in my experience, a quality of women who arrive somewhere by accident." The room was very quiet. Eleanor held Lady Miriam's gaze and said nothing, because she had learned, from her father, from necessity, from years of having very little and needing to protect what she had, that silence, correctly deployed, was more useful than almost any answer. Lady Miriam stood after a moment, smoothing her skirts. "I hope you are comfortable in the East Wing," she said pleasantly. "Do let Mrs. Crane know if you need anything." She left. Eleanor waited until her footsteps faded down the corridor. Then she turned her letter back over, dipped her pen, and wrote 3 words at the bottom of the page. "She suspects something." Eleanor had been 7 years old the first time her father showed her the document. He had taken it from a locked box beneath the floorboards of his study, a room that had smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and the particular sadness of a man who had once expected more from his life. He had unfolded it on the desk in front of her with the careful reverence of someone handling a religious text, smoothing the creases with his thumb, and then he had looked at her with his tired eyes and said, "Eleanor, I am going to tell you something important, and I need you to be old enough to understand it, even though you are not." She had been old enough. She had understood everything. The Voss family had not always been what they were when Eleanor was born into them. A drafty house, a leaking roof, debts that accumulated with the quiet persistence of damp. 2 generations before Eleanor, the Voss family had owned Voss Manor. 400 acres of good Derbyshire land, a substantial house, a name that meant something in the county. Not a grand name, not a duke's name, but solid, respected, real. Then Eleanor's grandfather had died young, leaving behind a young widow, 2 small children, and an estate that required a competent hand at precisely the moment it had none. The man who had offered that hand was Gerald Ashford, the 5th Duke's father, James Ashford's grandfather, who had presented himself as a benefactor, a family friend, a man of honor who wished only to help a widow in distress. What he had done instead was maneuver her into a property agreement she did not fully understand, in a language, legal language, contract language, that her grandfather had never thought to teach her, because her grandfather had never imagined she would need it. Within 3 years, Voss Manor had passed entirely to the Ashford estate. Within 5, Eleanor's grandmother had died. Within a generation, the Voss family had shrunk down to almost nothing. A small house, a small income, and a story that Eleanor's father had told her like a wound he couldn't stop pressing. "There is a document," he had said that afternoon in a study, "a deed of transfer, and beneath it, buried, because he was careful, because he was always careful, there is a letter. A letter your great-grandmother wrote to her solicitor, explaining that she had been deceived, that she had not understood what she was signing, that she wished to contest it." Eleanor had looked at the document on the desk. "Where is the letter?" she had asked. Her father had been quiet for a long moment. "In the Ashford archive," he had said. Where he put it. Eleanor stood in the corridor outside the East Library and reminded herself of all of this. She reminded herself of the roof, the debts, the expression on her father's face in the last years of his life. Not angry, which might have been easier to carry, but simply tired, ground down. The expression of a man who had accepted, slowly and without drama, that the world had taken something from him and was not going to give it back. She reminded herself that she was not here because she was reckless. She was here because she was the only person left. The corridor was empty. The house had settled into its afternoon quiet. The Duke was out riding, Lady Miriam was paying calls in the village, and Mrs. Crane had taken her weekly inventory of the linen cupboards, which Eleanor had established through careful observation, took approximately 2 hours. She had perhaps 90 minutes. She tried the library door. It opened. The East Library was smaller than the main library, a working room rather than a display room, lined with estate ledgers and legal volumes rather than Gibbon and Greek dictionaries. The record room Mrs. Crane had mentioned was through a door at the far end, half hidden behind a bookcase that had been pushed slightly in front of it, deliberately or through simple household drift, Eleanor couldn't tell. She moved the bookcase, carefully, noting its position so she could replace it exactly, and opened the door. The record room was narrow and smelled of old paper and beeswax. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, packed with leather-bound ledgers, document boxes, and the particular accumulated weight of a family that had been keeping records of itself for 200 years. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a moment and felt the size of what she was looking for. Somewhere in here, she thought. Somewhere in all of this. She started with the oldest section, the boxes dated to the early part of the century, which was when the transfer would have been recorded, and began to work. She was methodical. She had always been methodical. Her father had taught her that, too, in his way, by being the opposite, passionate and disorganized and brilliant, and ultimately ineffective. A man with every right feeling and none of the practical patience to act on them. Eleanor had inherited his feelings and supplied her own patience. She worked through the first 3 boxes in 40 minutes. Nothing. The 4th box was mislabeled. It said Estate Correspondence 1801 to 1804, but contained what appeared to be a collection of horse breeding records. Eleanor set it aside with the focused irritation of someone who does not have time for horse breeding records. The 5th box. She lifted the lid. And there, beneath a stack of tenant agreements, unremarkable, filed as though it were nothing at all, was a letter. The handwriting was not her great-grandmother's. It was a man's hand, bold and slightly careless, the hand of someone who wrote quickly and with confidence. Eleanor turned it over. The seal had been broken, opened and refolded long ago. She unfolded it. It was dated 1809. It was addressed to Gerald Ashford, and it was written by a solicitor named Heir, who had apparently been troubled enough by something to put his concerns in writing. The transfer had been conducted, he wrote, with some irregularity. The widow had expressed, subsequently, a wish to contest. He was writing to ask whether His Grace wished to address the matter formally, or... The sentence ended there. Eleanor stared at the cut edge of the paper where the rest of the letter had been removed. Someone had cut it, deliberately, carefully, leaving just enough to exist as a record of the correspondence, but removing whatever answer or instruction Gerald Ashford had given. Her hands were very steady. She was proud of them for that. She was still looking at the letter when she heard footsteps in the library. Not Mrs. Crane's footsteps. Mrs. Crane moved with a particular flat-footed rhythm that Eleanor had memorized in her first 2 days. These footsteps were different, lighter, quicker, with the specific cadence of someone moving through a familiar space without thinking about it. Lady Miriam. Eleanor folded the letter in one motion and pressed it flat inside the document box. Then she stood, turned, and was 3 steps from the record room door when Lady Miriam appeared in the library. They looked at each other. Lady Miriam's gaze went from Eleanor's face to the slightly displaced bookcase to the door of the record room, which Eleanor had not quite managed to close behind her. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "Miss Voss," Lady Miriam said. "Lady Miriam." Eleanor kept her voice perfectly even. "I was looking for the estate map. Mrs. Crane mentioned it was kept somewhere in the East Library. I seem to have taken a wrong turning." Lady Miriam looked at the record room door. Then she looked at Eleanor. "The estate maps," she said slowly, "are in the main library, in the cabinet beside the fireplace." "How foolish of me," Eleanor said. "Thank you." She walked out of the East Library with the same measured pace she had used leaving the main library 3 days ago. Not too fast, not too slow. The pace of a woman with nowhere in particular to be. She did not look back. But she knew, with the cold, certain clarity of someone whose plan has just developed its first serious crack, that Lady Miriam was still standing in the library doorway, watching her go, and that tomorrow morning Lady Miriam would go to the Duke. That night, Eleanor sat on the edge of her narrow bed and did the arithmetic of her situation. She had found something. Not the letter she needed, not her great-grandmother's letter, the one that would prove intent to contest, but something. The Heir letter was a thread, a solicitor's worry, recorded and then mutilated. It was the shape of a cover-up, even if it wasn't yet the proof of one. It was not enough, and Lady Miriam had seen her coming out of that room. Eleanor pressed her palms flat against her knees and breathed carefully, the way her father had taught her to breathe when things went badly. "Slowly, Eleanor, slowly, because panic is just fear in a hurry, and fear never helped anyone find anything." She had perhaps 1 day before Lady Miriam spoke to the Duke. 1 day to decide how much of the truth to offer, and to whom, and in what order. She thought about the Duke in the library. Who taught you Latin? The precision of it, the patience behind it, the sense of a man who had been quietly assembling a question for days before he asked it. He was not a fool. She had known he was not a fool. She had planned for him not being a fool. What she had not planned for, what she was finding it increasingly difficult to account for, was the way he looked at her sometimes. Not with suspicion, though that was there too, but with something else. Something that arrived unexpectedly in the spaces between the suspicion and stayed a little longer than it should. "Don't," she told herself firmly. She lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling of Ashford Park. "Don't." The ball was Lady Miriam's idea. Eleanor learned this from the housemaid who brought her morning tea, a girl named Betsy, who had not yet learned that talking while working was something the upper household staff considered beneath them, and who therefore talked constantly, which Eleanor found enormously useful. "Lady Miriam suggested it to His Grace last evening," Betsy said, straightening the curtains with cheerful efficiency. "Said the house had been too quiet, and that a small gathering would do everyone good. His Grace said he had no interest in gatherings, and Lady Miriam said that was precisely why he needed one. And then His Grace said, fine, if it would stop her from making that particular face at him." Eleanor, her hands wrapped around her tea, filed this away. "When?" she asked. "Saturday, miss, 3 days' time," Betsy beamed. "Mrs. Crane is already in a state about the flowers." Eleanor looked out the window at the gray Derbyshire morning and thought, 3 days. Lady Miriam had not gone to the Duke yet. Eleanor had watched her carefully at breakfast, that precise, cataloguing attention, and there had been nothing, no shifted dynamic, no new quality of suspicion in the Duke's eyes when he glanced across the table, which meant Lady Miriam was waiting, gathering more thread before she pulled it. 3 days, Eleanor thought again. Then a house full of people. Then whatever Lady Miriam has decided to do with what she knows. She drank her tea and began to think very carefully about Saturday. She spent the first day being useful. This was deliberate. A woman who made herself useful was a woman who moved through a household freely, carrying things, delivering messages, appearing in rooms where she had a plausible reason to be. Eleanor helped Mrs. Crane with the floral arrangements, which required multiple trips between the hothouse and the main reception rooms, and gave her an excellent geography of the ground floor. She assisted the housekeeper with the seating plan, which required access to the guest list and therefore a thorough knowledge of who would be in the house on Saturday. She mended a tear in the tablecloth in the dining room, which required sitting quietly in a corner for 2 hours while the footmen moved furniture around her and talked to each other as though she weren't there. She learned 3 things. 1. The record room had been locked since the day Lady Miriam had found her near it. A new lock, Mrs. Crane mentioned to a footman, installed on His Grace's instruction. 2. One of the Saturday guests was a Mr. Aldous Pemberton, an actual Pemberton, elderly and sharp-minded, who had apparently known every branch of the family for 60 years, and was considered by Lady Miriam to be, as she told Mrs. Crane, a wonderful resource on family history. 3. The Duke had cancelled 2 London engagements to remain at Ashford Park this week. Eleanor turned this last piece of information over in her mind for the rest of the day, and could not find a satisfactory explanation for it that didn't make her chest do something inconvenient. She spent the second day in the main library. The Duke found her there in the afternoon, or rather, she had anticipated that he would find her there and had arranged herself accordingly. In the chair nearest the window, in good light, with a volume of estate history open on her lap that was both genuinely interesting and conveniently relevant to the conversation she intended to have. He came in, saw her, and did not leave. This, Eleanor noted, was different from the first time. The first time he had come to his own library and found her on his ladder, and there had been the slight quality of intrusion, of a space reclaimed. This time he simply moved to his desk and began working, and the room settled around both of them with an ease that Eleanor found more unsettling than hostility would have been. They worked in silence for perhaps 20 minutes. Then the Duke said, without looking up, "You're reading the Ashford estate history." "It seemed impolite not to," Eleanor said, "given that I am a guest here." "Most guests don't read the estate history. Most guests are not as curious as I am." He looked up at that. The afternoon light was behind him, which meant Eleanor could read his expression more clearly than usual, and what she saw there was not quite what she expected. Not suspicion, something more complicated than that. The expression of a man who had been trying to solve a problem and had just noticed that the problem was more interesting than he'd initially given it credit for. "What are you curious about?" he asked. "The Derbyshire properties," Eleanor said, keeping her voice even. "The history of the land acquisitions in particular. Your family has been very thorough in expanding the estate over the generations." A pause. "Thorough," he repeated. "Comprehensive," Eleanor offered. Something moved across his face. There and gone, too quick to name. He looked back at his papers. "My grandfather was particularly active in that regard," he said, in a tone that revealed nothing, and somehow, Eleanor thought, revealed quite a lot. "So I understand," she said. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence, charged, careful, 2 people saying nothing while meaning a great deal. Eleanor closed the estate history, set it on the table, and stood. "I should dress for dinner," she said. "Miss Voss." She stopped. The Duke was looking at her directly now, not the assessing look, not the reading a document look, but something more direct than either of those. Something that made Eleanor very glad she had her back half-turned, because she was not entirely confident in her expression. "Are you comfortable here?" he asked. It was such an unexpected question that for a moment Eleanor had no answer for it. "Yes," she said at last. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Good," he said, and returned to his papers. Eleanor walked out of the library and spent the entire length of the corridor reminding herself, very firmly, why she was here. Saturday arrived with cold sunshine and the sound of carriages on the gravel drive. The guests were exactly what Eleanor had anticipated. County families, a sprinkling of London names, the particular mixture of the genuinely wealthy and the aspirationally wealthy that characterized Regency gatherings of this size. They arrived in pairs and groups, filling the entrance hall with voices and cold air and the rustling of good fabric, and Eleanor stood slightly to one side and watched the Duke receive them. He was good at it, she noted, better than she'd expected from a man who apparently had no interest in gatherings. He knew every name, asked the right questions, distributed his attention with the precision of someone who understood that social obligation, performed well, was a form of power. He was also, she observed, keeping track of where she was in the room. Not obviously, not in a way that anyone else would notice. But Eleanor had spent a week learning the specific quality of the Duke's attention, and she knew, with a certainty she found inconvenient, that every time she moved, something in him registered it. She found Mr. Aldous Pemberton before Lady Miriam could introduce them. He was exactly as described, elderly, sharp-eyed, with the lean alertness of a man who had spent 60 years noticing things and saw no reason to stop now. Eleanor sat next to him at the pre-dinner gathering, offered him tea, and asked him, with complete apparent innocence, about the Pemberton family history. He talked for 35 minutes without needing a single prompt. Eleanor listened to every word. By the time they went into dinner, she had established 3 things. That the Pemberton family had indeed had connections across Derbyshire going back a century, that Aldous Pemberton had known her grandmother's family by name, though distantly, and that he had absolutely no recollection of any Voss family connection to the Pembertons whatsoever. He had said this last part with the frowning concentration of a man searching his memory thoroughly. Voss, he had said. Voss. No, I can't place it. Curious. Curious indeed, Eleanor had thought, and smiled, and changed the subject. The dancing began after dinner. Eleanor had not expected to be asked. Poor relations stood at the edges of balls. This was the social grammar of the thing, as fixed as any law. She had positioned herself accordingly, near the windows, with a clear view of the room, and a glass of something she was not drinking. The Duke appeared at her elbow without warning. "Miss Voss," he said, "will you dance?" Eleanor looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that was almost, not quite, but almost, challenging. "I don't wish to take you from your other guests," she said. "You are one of my guests," he said, "unless you'd prefer to stand by the window for the remainder of the evening." "I find windows very interesting," Eleanor said. Miss Voss. She set down her glass and took his hand. She had not accounted for this. She had accounted for many things: the archive, Lady Miriam, Aldous Pemberton, the locked record room, the missing half of the Heir letter. She had built a careful architecture of contingency and preparation around every element of her time in this house. She had not accounted for what it would feel like to dance with James Ashford. He danced the way he did everything, without apparent effort, with complete attention, with the particular quality of presence that she had been trying to keep at a careful distance all week, and which was, at this proximity, very difficult to keep at any distance at all. "You spoke with Pemberton for some time before dinner," he said. His voice was low, pitched beneath the music. "He is very knowledgeable about the county families," Eleanor said. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Eleanor missed half a step, barely, almost imperceptibly, and recovered. "I beg your pardon?" "In the conversation," the Duke said. His eyes were on her face with that direct look she had been avoiding all week. "You sought him out deliberately, I noticed." "I introduced myself to a fellow guest," Eleanor said. "That is not generally considered unusual behavior at a dinner party." "No," he agreed, "though most guests don't choose their first conversation with such precision." The music moved them apart briefly, then together again. "You pay a great deal of attention to my movements, Your Grace," Eleanor said, when they were close enough to speak quietly again. Something shifted in his expression. Not the assessing look, not the document-reading look. Something that arrived without apparent intention and sat there, unguarded, for just a moment before he brought it back under control. "I find," he said carefully, "that you are difficult not to pay attention to." The music ended. They stood facing each other, closer than the dance strictly required, or perhaps exactly as close as it required. Eleanor couldn't trust her own judgment on that particular question. "Thank you for the dance, Your Grace," she said. She stepped back, curtsied, and turned away before he could respond. She was halfway across the room when she saw Lady Miriam, standing very still by the far door, watching Eleanor with an expression that had moved past suspicion entirely and arrived somewhere considerably more purposeful. Eleanor held her gaze for one moment. Then she looked away and found the nearest chair and sat in it and placed her hands very quietly in her lap. Tomorrow, she thought, Lady Miriam will go to him tomorrow. And before she did, Eleanor needed to decide exactly how much of the truth she was willing to offer, and to whom, and whether the look on James Ashford's face during that dance was something she could afford to trust. She was very much afraid that it was. She was very much afraid that she was going to trust it anyway. Lady Miriam went to the Duke at 10 o'clock in the morning. Eleanor knew because she watched her go. She had been in the morning room, positioned at the writing desk with a clear sightline to the corridor, under the pretense of correspondence, when Lady Miriam walked past with the particular quality of purpose that Eleanor had learned to read in her over the past week. Not hurried, never hurried, but directed, the way a compass needle is directed, with the quiet inevitability of something that has been pointing in one direction for a very long time and has finally been allowed to move. Eleanor set down her pen. She gave them 15 minutes. Then she went to the Duke's study and knocked on the door. The silence before he answered was 3 seconds longer than usual. "Come in." Eleanor opened the door. The Duke was at his desk. Lady Miriam was in the chair opposite him, or had been, Eleanor suspected, because she was standing now, which meant she had risen when she heard the knock, which meant she had not expected Eleanor to be the one knocking, which meant the conversation had not yet reached its conclusion. The three of them looked at each other. "Miss Voss," the Duke said. His voice was perfectly even. "I was just about to send for you." "I know," Eleanor said. "That is why I came." Lady Miriam's eyes moved between them. Then she said, with the dignity of a woman who understands a scene better than she would like to, "I believe I will leave you both to it." She left, and Eleanor noted, she could not help noting, that she did not close the door fully behind her. Eleanor crossed the room and closed it herself. The Duke watched her do this. "Sit down, Miss Voss," he said. "I'd rather stand, if you don't mind." "I do mind, actually." A pause. Eleanor sat. He looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. Not the reading a document look, not the look from the dance, but something between the two. Careful, measuring. The look of a man who has been handed several pieces of a puzzle and is deciding, with some deliberation, which one to pick up first. "Lady Miriam tells me," he said at last, "that she found you coming out of the record room 4 days ago." "Yes," Eleanor said. "She tells me you said you were looking for the estate maps." "Yes." "The estate maps," he said, "are in the main library. I know that now." "Did you know it then?" Eleanor looked at him directly. "No." He absorbed this, the specific quality of the no, the fact that she hadn't dressed it up. "What were you looking for?" he asked. And here it was, the moment she had been constructing and rehearsing and dreading in equal measure since the night she had first unfolded her father's document in the lamplight of a York coaching inn. Eleanor had planned for this conversation. She had planned several versions of it, a careful version, a strategic version, a version in which she revealed just enough to satisfy without exposing the full shape of what she knew. She had been over each version so many times that she could have delivered any of them without thinking. She delivered none of them. "My name is Eleanor Voss," she said. "That part is true. But I am not a relation of yours, not even a distant one. The letter of introduction I presented when I arrived was not entirely accurate." The Duke was very still. "I see," he said, in a tone that suggested he was seeing considerably more than 2 words could contain. "My family were, the Vosses of Voss Manor," Eleanor continued. "Derbyshire. The estate was transferred to the Ashford family approximately 40 years ago through an agreement made with my widowed great-grandmother. She kept her voice level. She had promised herself she would keep her voice level. She did not fully understand what she was signing. There is evidence, there was a letter, from your grandfather's solicitor, that the irregularity of the transfer was noted at the time and subsequently managed. Silence. I came here, Eleanor said, because the document I have establishing my family's original claim requires corroboration from your archive. There is a letter, my great-grandmother's letter, to her own solicitor contesting the transfer, which your grandfather apparently retained. I believe it is in the record room. She paused, or was. The room has been locked since Lady Miriam saw me near it. The Duke said nothing. The silence was the most frightening silence Eleanor had sat in since her father's study when she was 7 years old and he had told her about the document under the floor. "I should have told you this when I arrived," Eleanor said. "I know that. I told myself I would find the letter first, that I would come to you with the full proof in hand rather than a partial claim and a forged introduction. I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I thought you would send me away, before I had what I needed." "And now?" the Duke said. "Now Lady Miriam has seen me near the record room, and I have found part of what I needed, and I am sitting in your study, having lied to you for 10 days. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "So I am telling you the truth, most of it." "Most of it," he repeated. "The rest is in the record room." Another silence, different from the last one, though Eleanor could not quite name how. The Duke stood. He moved to the window, his back to her, and stood looking out at the grey Derbyshire morning for what felt like a very long time. "The Voss family," he said finally, without turning. "I know the name." Eleanor's hands, flat on her knees, were very still. "My father mentioned it once," the Duke continued, "when I was perhaps 12. I asked him about some of the older estate acquisitions. I had found the ledgers. I was a curious child. And he told me that some of the older transfers were complicated. That his father had been a man of his time." He paused. He said it in the way people say things they don't wish to examine too closely. Eleanor said nothing. The Duke turned from the window. His expression was not what she had expected. Not cold, not the carefully composed blankness of aristocratic displeasure. He looked, Eleanor thought, like a man who had been handed a problem he had not asked for and was too honest to pretend he hadn't received it. "You should have come to me directly," he said. "I know. You should not have lied about who you were. I know that too. What you did—" He stopped. His jaw tightened briefly. "What you did was a considerable trespass, Miss Voss, against my household, against my trust." "Yes," Eleanor said quietly, "it was." He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had looked at her during the dance, without the careful management of expression that he usually maintained. And Eleanor looked back at him, because she had nothing left to hide behind, and no version of this moment that she had planned for, and found that, stripped of strategy, she was simply herself, tired and truthful, and more frightened than she had been at any point in the past 10 days. "I would like you to leave," the Duke said. Eleanor stood. "I understand. I will have Norris arrange a carriage for this afternoon." "Thank you." She walked to the door. Her hand was on the handle when he spoke again. "Miss Voss." She stopped. "Leave the document you found in the record room," he said, "whatever you took." Eleanor's hand tightened on the door handle. "I didn't take anything," she said. "I didn't have time." A pause. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to tell me what you found." Eleanor turned around and told him about the Hale letter. The solicitor's worry, the cut edge, the shape of a thing that had been deliberately incomplete for 40 years. The Duke listened without interrupting. His face, through all of it, gave nothing away. But his hands, she noticed his hands, flat on the desk, pressing slightly harder than necessary against the wood. His hands gave away a great deal. When she finished, he said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I will look into it." "Your Grace, I said I will look into it." He met her eyes. "You have my word." Eleanor studied him. This man who had every reason to simply send her away and close the record room and let 40 years of careful management continue to be carefully managed. This man whose grandfather had done something that could not be undone, but, perhaps, be answered for. She did not know if she believed him. She discovered, standing in his study doorway, that she wanted to. "Thank you," she said, and left. She was packed within the hour. One bag, the same bag she had arrived with, still slightly misshapen from the journey, sat on the bed while Eleanor moved through the small East Wing room with the methodical thoroughness of someone erasing evidence of their own presence. She stripped the writing desk of her papers, returned the borrowed books to their proper places, and stood for a moment looking at the narrow bed and the cold fireplace, and the window that looked out over the east lawn, where the morning frost had not yet fully lifted. 10 days. She had been here 10 days. It felt, inconveniently, like longer. Betsy came to help her carry the bag down, talking the entire way. Something about the weather, something about the Saturday ball, something about how it was a shame Miss Voss was leaving so soon. And Eleanor listened with half her attention and kept the other half on the entrance hall, where Norris was arranging the carriage and the Duke was nowhere to be seen. She had not expected him to be there. She had not let herself expect it. The carriage was brought round at 2 o'clock. Eleanor climbed in, settled her bag at her feet, and did not look back at the house. She was 3 miles down the road to the coaching inn when she allowed herself to think about the expression on his face when she had told him about the Heir letter. Not disbelief, not the careful blankness of a man receiving information he intended to do nothing about. Something that looked, to Eleanor's careful and experienced eye, very much like recognition, as though she had handed him a piece of something he had already half known was there, waiting in the dark of the archive room for someone honest enough to name it. "I will look into it," he had said. "You have my word." Eleanor looked out at the gray Darishborough road and told herself, very firmly, that a man's word was not a plan. That she had come here for a document and left without it. That the situation was, by any reasonable measure, significantly worse than when she had arrived. She told herself all of this, and then she thought about his hands, pressing flat against the desk. And she looked out at the frost-pale fields and did not, for the remainder of the journey, manage to think about anything else at all. That night, in the coaching inn, in the narrow bed that was somehow both identical to and entirely unlike the narrow bed in the East Wing, Eleanor lay awake and listened to the rain begin again, and thought about what came next. She had the partial Heir letter, memorized word for word, though she hadn't touched it. She had her father's deed of transfer, still tucked against her ribs, still waiting for the corroboration she had not been able to retrieve. She had the name of a solicitor, Heir, and a date, and the shape of something that had been cut away. She had also the Duke's word, which was either everything or nothing, and she did not yet know which. She closed her eyes. Outside, the rain fell on the Darishborough road that led back to Ashford Park, and Eleanor Voss, who had ridden that road once already in the rain and had not looked back, lay in the dark and thought about looking back. And then, at some point in the small hours of the morning, she slept. She woke to the sound of a horse on the cobbles below. She lay still for a moment, listening. Single horse, moving with purpose, not with the loose ambling of a traveler stopping for the night. The sound stopped directly below the inn. Eleanor sat up. Downstairs she heard voices, the innkeeper, surprised, deferential in the way innkeepers were deferential to a very specific kind of arrival. Then footsteps on the stairs, unhurried and deliberate. The footsteps of a man who had never once needed to rush anywhere. Eleanor stared at the door of her room. Her heart was doing something she had absolutely no patience for. 3 knocks. Quiet. Precise. She got up, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, crossed the room, opened the door. James Ashford stood in the corridor of a Derrishborough coaching inn, his coat darkened with rain, holding a leather document case. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I told you I would look into it," he said. His voice was entirely steady, which Eleanor found, under the circumstances, almost offensive. "It is 2 o'clock in the morning," he said. "Yes," he said, "I found what I was looking for faster than I expected." Eleanor looked at the document case. Then she stepped back and let him in. The innkeeper had left a lamp burning on the table by the window. It cast a small, warm circle of light in the otherwise dark room. Enough to read by, enough to see by, enough to make the whole situation feel considerably more intimate than Eleanor was prepared for. She moved the lamp to the writing desk, pulled the desk chair to one side, and gestured to the room's single armchair with the brisk efficiency of a woman establishing that this was a practical meeting and nothing else. The Duke sat in the armchair. He set the document case on the table between them. He was still in his riding clothes, no cravat, coat unbuttoned at the collar, and his hair was damp from the rain. Eleanor had never seen him anything other than perfectly composed in appearance, and the effect of this small dishevelment was profoundly inconvenient. He looked like himself, only more so, like a version of James Ashford that existed before the title had been fully applied. She sat down across from him and folded her hands in her lap. "Show me," she said. He opened the document case. The first thing he laid on the table was a letter. Old paper, faded ink, the handwriting of a woman who had learned to write in a different century. Eleanor's hands moved toward it before she could stop them. She pulled them back. "Read it," the Duke said. She picked it up. It was her great-grandmother's letter, the one her father had described, the one that had existed, in Eleanor's imagination, for 20 years as a kind of mythological object, the thing that would make everything right, the proof that her family had not simply failed, but had been failed. She had constructed it so many times in her mind that she had stopped believing it would look like anything in particular. It looked like a letter, 12 lines. The handwriting was slightly uneven, the hand of someone writing quickly or writing under distress. The language was formal in the way that women of that era were formal, even in private communication, every feeling at one remove from its expression. "I wish it to be recorded," her great-grandmother had written, "that the agreement signed on the 14th was not understood by me in its full implications at the time of signing, and that I was given to believe, by the party representing His Grace, that the arrangement was temporary in nature. I wish to contest." The letter ended there. Eleanor set it down on the table and looked at the cut edge. "The rest was removed," she said. "Yes." The Duke reached into the document case again, but not destroyed. He laid a second piece of paper beside the first. The same handwriting, the same paper, the cut edge matched exactly, fitting together like the two halves of something that had been kept apart for 40 years. The second piece was shorter, 3 lines, and a signature. "This agreement in its entirety, and to seek proper legal remedy for what has been done to my family and my children. Margaret Voss." Eleanor stared at it. Then she stared at the two pieces together. The whole letter, reunited on a table in a Derbyshire coaching inn in the middle of the night, by the man whose grandfather had cut it apart. "Where was it?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She was very proud of it for that. "In my grandfather's personal correspondence," the Duke said. "A separate box, not in the archive, in his private papers, which are kept in my father's old study. I don't go in there often." A pause. "I should have gone in there sooner." Eleanor looked up. "You couldn't have known," she said. "No." His jaw was tight. "But my father knew. I believe he knew. He said as much the day I asked him about the older acquisitions. He chose not to look any further." He was quiet for a moment. "I find I am not willing to make the same choice." The lamp flickered. Outside, the rain had softened to something quieter, not the driving rain of her arrival at Ashford Park 10 days ago, but the gentle, persistent rain of a Derbyshire night that had decided to last until morning. Eleanor looked at the two halves of her great-grandmother's letter. Margaret Voss. She had never known her. She had died before Eleanor's father was grown, worn away by the long diminishment of a life that should have been different. Eleanor had only ever known her through her father's stories, a woman of sense and courage, he always said, who had been given neither the tools nor the time to fight back. She had fought back. She had written a letter and tried to contest it and been silenced in the most practical way available. The evidence removed, the record room locked, the story reduced over 2 generations to something that could be called bitterness or misremembering or the natural sad decline of a family that simply hadn't managed. She had fought back, and now Eleanor was sitting in a coaching inn reading the proof of it, and the man across the table had ridden through the rain to bring it to her. Eleanor set the letter down very carefully and looked out the window at the dark Derbyshire road. She would not cry. She had promised herself a very long time ago that she would not cry about this until it was finished. It was not yet finished. "There is more," the Duke said quietly. She looked at him. He reached into the document case a third time and laid something else on the table. Not a letter, but a folded document, heavier paper, official. Eleanor recognized the format before she had read a word of it. A deed. She unfolded it. Voss Manor and its associated lands and properties comprising 412 acres in the county of Derbyshire. She read it twice. Then she looked up. "This is a deed of transfer," she said carefully, "back to the Voss family. It requires your signature," the Duke said, "and the signature of my solicitor, who will be here on Monday. But yes." Eleanor looked at the document. Then at him. "You had this drawn up today," she said. "This afternoon, before you left, actually." He held her gaze without apology. "I had my suspicions about what I would find in my grandfather's papers. I wanted to be ready." "You drew up a deed of transfer before you'd found the letter." "I drew up a deed of transfer," he said evenly, "because it was the right thing to do. The letter confirmed it. It did not create the obligation." Eleanor set the deed down. She looked at this man who had looked at her on his doorstep in the rain with mild displeasure and given her the worst guest room and asked her who taught her Latin and danced with her and sent her away and then ridden through the dark to a coaching inn with a document case full of 40 years of buried wrong. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. "I told you, it is the right—" "Not the deed," Eleanor said. "Why did you come tonight? You could have sent a letter. You could have waited until Monday when your solicitor arrives. You could have— There are 20 ways to handle this that do not involve riding to a coaching inn at 2 in the morning." She held his gaze. "Why did you come tonight?" The Duke was quiet. Outside, the rain fell softly on the cobblestones. The lamp burned. The two halves of Margaret Voss's letter lay on the table between them, reunited after 40 years. "I did not ride through the rain for a document, Miss Voss," he said. The words were quiet, deliberate, the words of a man who has chosen them carefully and is not going to take them back. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "James," she said, "not your Grace, not the Duke, just the name, the actual name," because she was too tired for titles and too truthful for distance, and they were alone in a room at 2 in the morning with 40 years of wrong laid out on the table between them, and she was done. She was entirely done with half of things. Something in his face shifted. That unguarded look from the dance returned, and this time he didn't bring it back under control. "Eleanor," he said. "I lied to you," she said. "For 10 days. I came into your house under a false name with a forged introduction and searched your archive without permission. You have every reason not to trust me." "I know," he said, "and I have every reason not to trust you. Your family took everything from mine." "I know that too." "So," Eleanor said, "what do we do with that?" The Duke leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, close enough that the small circle of lamplight held them both. His eyes were very direct. "I find," he said carefully, "that I am less interested in what we do with it than in whether you are willing to find out." Eleanor looked at him, this careful, complicated, unexpectedly honest man who had looked right through her and then looked at her and then come back in the rain when she had given him every reason not to. "That is not an answer," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's a question. I am asking whether you'll stay." A pause. Outside, the rain. Inside, the lamp. Eleanor Voss, who had arrived at Ashford Park with a forged letter and a document, and the kind of desperation that makes a woman either very dangerous or very foolish, looked at James Ashford across a table covered in 40 years of her family's history, and reached out, and picked up the deed of transfer, and said, "I will need somewhere to stay until Monday when your solicitor arrives." The Duke looked at the deed in her hands. Then he looked at her face, and for the first time since Eleanor had appeared on his doorstep in the rain, James Ashford smiled. Not the controlled social expression she had seen him deploy at the ball, not the wry, almost amusement from the library, but something real and unguarded and entirely unplanned. The smile of a man who has just received an answer he did not entirely dare to hope for. "Ashford Park," he said, "has a great many guest rooms." "I know," Eleanor said. "I've been in the worst one." He laughed. It was a good laugh, surprised out of him, genuine. Eleanor felt it like something unlocking in her chest, some last careful tension releasing that she hadn't known she was still holding. She set the deed back on the table between them. They sat in the small circle of lamplight in the coaching inn while the rain fell gently on the Derbyshire road, and the two halves of Margaret Voss's letter lay reunited on the table, and did not move for a long time, and talked, really talked, without strategy or pretense or the careful management of information, until the lamp burned low and the rain stopped, and the first gray light of a Derbyshire dawn appeared in the window. On Monday, the solicitor arrived. Eleanor signed the deed of transfer at 11 o'clock in the morning in the Duke's study, with Norris and Mrs. Crane as witnesses. Lady Miriam was not present. She had announced, the previous evening, that she intended to visit her sister in Bath for the remainder of the month. Eleanor and the Duke did not discuss Lady Miriam. They had agreed, quietly and without making a formal agreement of it, that there were more important things to discuss. The solicitor, a thin, precise man named Mr. Webb, who had clearly been briefed thoroughly, and had equally clearly decided that his professional discretion was the better part of wisdom, produced the documents, witnessed the signatures, and departed within the hour. Voss Manor was Eleanor's. She stood in the study after Mr. Webb had gone, and held the signed deed in both hands, and felt, not triumph exactly, not the clean satisfaction she had imagined all those years ago in her father's study. Something more complicated than that. Something that had room in it for grief, for her father and her grandmother and Margaret Voss, who had written a letter and been silenced. And also, unexpectedly, quietly, for something else entirely. The Duke was watching her from across the room. "All right?" he said. Eleanor looked up. "Yes," she said, "I think so." She looked back at the deed. "My father would have... he would have been..." She stopped. "I know," the Duke said quietly. He crossed the room and stood beside her, and said nothing else, which was exactly the right thing. After a moment, Eleanor folded the deed carefully and held it against her chest, the way her father had held his document in his study all those years ago, with the reverence of something that had cost a great deal and was finally, after everything, in the right hands. "Thank you," she said. "It was yours," he said simply. "It always was." The roses at Voss Manor had been the first thing Eleanor restored. Not the roof, though the roof had needed it desperately and had been seen to within the first month. Not the East Wing drawing room, which had been stripped of its furniture at some point in the intervening 40 years and now echoed unpleasantly when you walked through it. Not the gardens, which had gone to a beautiful, melancholy wildness that Eleanor had found she couldn't quite bring herself to tame entirely. The roses first, because her father had told her once that her great-grandmother had planted them herself. A long border along the south-facing wall, pale pink and cream and deep red, and that they had still been blooming when he was a boy, and that he had thought about them sometimes, in the years after, when thinking about Voss Manor was something he still allowed himself to do. Eleanor had found 3 of the original plants still alive beneath 40 years of neglect, gnarled and stubborn and improbably surviving, the way that things sometimes survive when no one has thought to tell them they shouldn't. She had taken this as a sign. It was a Tuesday in late June when James came back from London. Eleanor heard the carriage on the gravel drive and did not go to the window. She had learned, over the course of the year, that going to the window every time she heard a carriage was an undignified habit she was better off without. She stayed at her desk in the Voss Manor library, her library now, still half empty, filling slowly with books she chose herself, and continued reading the letter from the solicitor in York about the school. She had read perhaps 3 more lines when the library door opened. She looked up. James Ashford, 6th Duke of Ashford, stood in the doorway of her library with his traveling coat still on and his hair slightly disordered from the journey, and the particular expression he wore when he had been in London longer than he wished and was now, finally, somewhere he actually wanted to be. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You're early," she said. "The meeting's finished yesterday." He came inside, dropping his coat over the back of the nearest chair in the way that still made the Voss Manor housekeeper quietly despair. "I didn't see the point in staying." "How was Parliament?" "Loud, tedious, full of men saying important things in the most inefficient way possible." He came around the desk and looked at what she was reading. "The school? Mr. Finch writes that the builders will be finished by September." Eleanor set the letter down. "Which means we can open in January, if the teacher appointments go smoothly." "And will they?" "Miss Hartley has accepted. She comes very well recommended." Eleanor paused. "She also writes that she is not afraid of mud or cold weather, which I consider essential given the Derbyshire winter." "Sensible woman," James said. He was still standing beside her desk, closer than strictly necessary, which was a habit of his that Eleanor had entirely given up trying to address, and looking at the letter with the focused attention he brought to everything she was working on. Not performing interest, actually interested. This was one of the things Eleanor had discovered about James Ashford over the course of a year, that his attention, which had seemed so pointed and unsettling when it was directed at her across a breakfast table in the early days of her deception, was simply the way he moved through the world. He paid attention. To her work, to the manor, to the names of the tenant families, and the condition of the South Field, and the state of the rose border, and the letters that arrived from York. It had taken Eleanor some months to stop waiting for this to be a strategy. It was simply who he was. They walked the grounds before dinner, a habit they had fallen into without discussing it, the way that comfortable habits establish themselves between 2 people who have stopped pretending they don't want the same things. The June evening was long and golden, the kind of evening that made the Derbyshire landscape look deliberately beautiful, as though it had been arranged by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. The south lawn was in good repair now, the wildness of the gardens pulled back to something that retained its character without being quite so emphatic about it. Eleanor stopped at the rose border. The 3 original plants had put out an extraordinary show this year, as though, given proper soil and proper attention after 40 years of neglect, they had decided to make a point about what they were capable of. Pale pink blooms, deep red, cream. Her great-grandmother's roses, blooming in her great-grandmother's garden. James stopped beside her. "Your father would have liked this," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "He would have stood here for a very long time and not say anything, and then said something completely inadequate to describe what he was feeling." She smiled. "He was better with documents than with words." "I wonder where you get that from." Eleanor looked at him. "I am very good with words." "You are extraordinary with words," he said. "You talked your way into my house with a forged letter. I am simply noting the genetic component." "You're insufferable," Eleanor said, without heat. "You've mentioned that. I'll mention it again." James smiled, that real, unguarded smile that she had first seen in the coaching inn, and which, still, a year later, did something completely unreasonable to her composure. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with the easy familiarity of a man who has entirely forgotten to be careful about such things. Eleanor had entirely forgotten to mind. London had talked, of course. London always talked. The story had circulated through the season with the irresistible momentum of a scandal that was also, frustratingly for those who wished to condemn it, not quite condemnable. A woman of good family, it turned out, with a legitimate historical claim to an estate that had been improperly acquired 2 generations ago, who had been acknowledged as such by the Duke himself, who had then married her in a quiet ceremony in the Ashford Park Chapel in March. The how of it, the forged letter, the East Wing guest room, the 10 days under a false introduction, was known in its broad outlines by perhaps 6 people and discussed in whispered specifics by considerably more. Eleanor had found, to her mild surprise, that she did not particularly mind. She had spent a long time caring about things she couldn't control, and not enough time on the things she could. She was done with that particular arrangement. Lady Miriam had sent a very correct letter of congratulation from Bath, which Eleanor had answered with equal correctness and genuine goodwill. She did not dislike Lady Miriam. She understood her, a woman who had built her security in someone else's household and had recognized, correctly, the threat that Eleanor represented to it. Given the same circumstances, Eleanor thought she might have done the same. She had written this to Lady Miriam in slightly more diplomatic language. Lady Miriam had written back a letter that was, for the first time, entirely without formality. It was 3 lines long. It said, "You are more generous than I deserve, and more perceptive than is comfortable. I begin to see why he married you." Eleanor had kept the letter. After dinner, James found her in the library again. She was usually in the library again, which he had stopped pretending to find surprising. Sitting on the window seat with a book open on her lap, and the long June twilight still doing its best against the darkening sky outside. He settled into the armchair across from her, picked up the book she had left on the side table, the estate history of Ashford Park, which she had finally borrowed properly and with permission, and opened it without comment. They read in companionable silence for a while. This was another thing Eleanor had discovered about James Ashford, that he was, beneath all of it, a man who was entirely content to sit in a room with someone he trusted and say nothing. She had grown up in a house full of her father's anxious industry, the constant movement of a man who couldn't be still because stillness let the worry in. She had not known before this year that 2 people could simply exist in a room together in the quiet and have it feel like enough. It was, she had decided, her favorite thing. "The builders confirmed Thursday," she said, without looking up from her book. "Good," he said. "The East classroom will be finished first." "Good. Miss Hartley writes that she would like to begin with 12 students." "I have told her she may have 20. James looked up from the estate history. 20. "The waiting list is already long," Eleanor said. "I'm not going to make children wait because we're being cautious about numbers." He looked at her for a moment. That particular look, the one that had started as reading a document and had become, over the course of a year, something entirely different. Something that Eleanor had stopped trying to name because the name for it was obvious, and she had decided she didn't need to be efficient about everything. 20, he said. 20, she confirmed. "You're going to need another teacher." "I know. I'm writing to Edinburgh." She turned a page. "There are women there who have been waiting for exactly this kind of position." James returned to the estate history. "Of course there are," he said, and Eleanor could hear the smile in it without looking up. Later, when the last of the twilight had finally given up, and the library had gone properly dark except for the 2 lamps they'd lit without discussing it, Eleanor set her book down and looked around the room. She looked at the shelves, half full, filling, the desk with its organized correspondence, the solicitor's letters and the school plans, and the notes from the tenant meetings she had attended every month since taking formal ownership of the estate. The window that looked out over the south lawn and the rose border that she could not see in the dark but knew was there. She looked at James, asleep in the armchair with the Ashford estate history open on his chest, his head tilted slightly to one side, entirely unguarded in the way that people are unguarded in sleep. She thought about her father's study, the document under the floor, the 7-year-old girl who had been asked to understand something she was not old enough for and had understood it anyway, had carried it, in fact, for 20 years across coaching inns and borrowed rooms and one very cold East Wing guest room, all the way to this library, this lamplight, this life that had not existed a year ago, and which now felt, with a solidity that still occasionally surprised her, entirely real. Margaret Voss, she thought. Look. She reached over and gently removed the estate history from James's hands before it could fall. He stirred, half awake. "Eleanor," he said, in the slightly confused way of someone surfacing from sleep. "Go to bed," she said. "I wasn't asleep. You were entirely asleep. I was resting my eyes. You were snoring. I don't snore. James." He opened his eyes properly and looked at her, sleepy, unguarded, entirely himself. The version of James Ashford that existed before the title had been fully applied, that she had glimpsed for the first time in a coaching inn doorway in the rain, and had been, she could admit now, entirely lost to from that moment. "Come to bed," he said. "In a moment," she said. He stood, with the slow deliberateness of a man who has been asleep in an armchair and is not entirely pleased about what this has done to his back, and paused beside her on his way to the door. He looked at her for a moment, the lamplight, her book, the half-dark library of Voss Manor. "You look," he said, "extremely settled." "I am," Eleanor said, "extremely." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, easy, unhurried, the gesture of a man who has stopped rationing such things, and went to bed. Eleanor sat in the lamplight for a little while longer. Outside the window, in the dark Derryshire garden, her great-grandmother's roses were blooming. The school opened in January as planned. It began with 20 students. By the following September, it had 34. Miss Hartley, as Eleanor had predicted, was not afraid of mud or cold weather. The Voss Manor rose border was noted in 3 separate correspondence letters that season as the finest in the county. Lady Miriam returned from Bath in the spring and took up residence in the Ashford Dower House, which had been quietly and thoroughly renovated in her absence. She did not discuss this with Eleanor. Eleanor did not make her. James attended Parliament every session and came home from London as early as the business would allow. No one at Ashford Park, or at Voss Manor, or anywhere else that mattered, ever called Eleanor a poor relation again. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. If you're still here, we'd truly love to know where you're watching from. Reading your comments is one of our favorite parts. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe.